and we're a member organisation that was founded 8 years ago. We're passionate about helping women progress and also addressing the gender gap in financial and professional services. Our mission is to see more women thrive and grow, and obviously help them achieve success on their terms. So that's what Few does. But when I was chatting to Tiffany, we went, you know what, the conversation is bigger than gender. And so together, Tiff and I are going to broaden that conversation for you over the next 3-part series. We're going to bring you some inspiring guests with different stories and backgrounds, but who all face very similar challenges and obstacles along the way. So again, a big welcome to the Diversity series. Tiff, I know you're there as well.
I'm here. So excited for this, Alex, and thank you to Few for this opportunity. You have over 20 years experience in financial services. I have experience in investment banking and sport, and together we are both really passionate about systemic change. As you said, gender being part of that, but it's bigger than that. And so we're really excited to bring 3 inspiring people to this series to share their stories, unpick a little bit of their journey, and talk about some practical tips about how to advocate for systemic change. Who have we got coming up, Cam? Here we go. So today we've got Tain, and we will dive into Tain's bio shortly. You'll hear all about her, but welcome, Tain. We're excited to have you here. Next week we'll have Andrew Fraser. So Andrew was the former Treasurer of Queensland, and you'll see there he's also the Chair of Sunsuper and serves on a number of other boards, and he'll have a really interesting perspective to share with us. And then the third week, we've got Sam Bloom, who is such an inspiration, and everyone's really going to enjoy her story. She's a surfer, adventure traveller, neurology nurse, and has a really personal story about her family and some tragic tragedy that they faced. And she's going to talk about that and talk about how she advocates for change now herself. So really excited for this group.
Well, without further ado, Tiff, I might introduce then our amazing guest today. No pressure at all, Tate, and then we'll jump into a really great conversation. So for those of you who don't yet know Tain, she's the Brisbane Broncos Women's Premiership CEO and also the General Manager for HR, Risk and Compliance. Tain's passionate about football, sports, business, and increasing female participation across all of the above. She's the CEO, as I said, of the Brisbane Broncos National Rugby League women's team, as well as being the General Manager for HR, Risk and Compliance. With over 10 years' experience working at an executive level across the elite sport and mining resource sector as part of medium, large and global organisations, Tain is an intuitive leader with a proven record of success in senior leadership roles. Possessing over 20 years' experience across both strategic and operational human resources and safety functions, Tain's experience includes commercial and financial management, advising on and implementing strategy, business development and risk management with a focus on delivering commercial results. Most recently, Tain has played a key part in working with the NRL to establish the National Rugby League Women's Premiership competition and develop a national pathway strategy, and led the club's inclusion in the competition to be crowned the inaugural winners of the NRL Holden Women's Premiership, followed up by a second premiership win in 2019. With a vision to continue to build female participation across all levels of business, particularly in non-traditional roles, this work has ignited a passion to become involved in and support programs focused on health, leadership and women's protection, with a focus on providing pathways for female empowerment to deliver social change. Away from work, Tain has an understanding husband and 2 young sons who are 8 and 5, who all love to travel and enjoy the outdoors, swimming, boating or playing sport. Wow, Tain, I can't wait for this conversation.
Welcome. We're so excited to have you, Tain. Alex has done the formal bio, but as we like to do here on these Few series, we want to hear a little bit from yourself about your own journey, and then we'll dive into some specifics about systemic change.
Wow, it sounds like I know what I'm doing with that bio. I'm like the little duck with the legs going underneath the water. But look, I really appreciate the invitation. I'm really excited to be a part of the series. I think it's really important and a great platform to start having some great conversations around how do we implement systemic change. And certainly, you know, Few is going to be on the front foot in that. So I guess a little bit about me in a snapshot as best I can. I like to say I'm an open book, so you might hear some stories that resonate or don't resonate with you, but certainly I actually grew up in Newcastle, so I grew up with mum and dad and 3 sisters, 3 very competitive sisters, who all played a lot of sport, and we were quite a close family, growing up. Growing up in an all-female household, we were certainly very fortunate that our parents instilled in us, the belief that we could do anything, and that really we were in charge of our own destinies. So, that self-belief and support, and certainly the ongoing support that I, give thanks to my husband for. I can honestly say I don't think I've ever really thought I couldn't do something because I was a woman. And that really sort of kind of transcends into my journey in mining. I spent 20 years in mining, working in rural and remote regions. Not to say, I didn't have my challenges. I can recall, my first appointment to a senior leadership role, and I got a call from the head of HR, and he said, "Congratulations, you're the youngest person to be appointed to a senior leadership team role, and you're a girl, so don't F it up." So that was my introduction to leadership. And fortunately, I'd worked in mining for some period of time. I had a good relationship with him at the time, so I could laugh it off. But I guess, that's really the start of the journey of going, oh, actually, I am a female, and perhaps I am going to have to do things differently, to what I'd been brought up with. Some of the defining moments for me, in my career have really come through adversity and challenge, and not the least of which resulted in, my marriage broke down after a number of years. I'd sacrificed a lot. All I did was work, and I didn't put my family or my husband first, which then resulted in me doing a 4-month sabbatical volunteering in Ecuador and traveling around Spain, which gave me some great time to really reflect on what was important to me. I came back, and 12 months later, I was fortunate enough to reconnect with my husband, which then produced 2 beautiful children, over a period of years. And I guess, at that point in time, it really put my life in perspective about what I really wanted and what I valued. And it wasn't, to dedicate my life to work anymore. It was about having some balance. So I made a decision that mining probably wasn't for me anymore. I didn't want to go out to a mine site and work 7 days a week. So I actually started doing some research on what type of organisations I'd like to work for. And it was really based on what are growth industries, what type of organisations are aligned to my values and culture. And I spent quite a bit of time doing research. I was also very interested in sports. I knew I didn't want to do resources anymore. So quite literally, I had a list of organisations that I researched, that I explored. And I looked at the Broncos, and I felt they were a really great fit. They're an excellent brand. They give back to the community. Their values really align with that of mine. And so quite literally, in the spirit of don't die wondering, I actually picked up the phone and I called Paul White, who I'd worked with previously, and just said, "Do you think you could use someone like me?" And he said, "I can, but I can't afford you." So, at that point in time, I had to make a bit of a life decision, and fortunately my husband, was able to, we came up with a decision that it's not about the money. It's really about, what sort of kind of resonates with us as a family, and what resonates with me as an individual. And so I took the leap. So I left mining and I moved to the Broncos. And 12 months into the role, Paul spoke to me about an opportunity to take the lead, to be the CEO of the women's competition. And, at that time, I didn't know if I could do the role. I knew I love sport, I knew I love footy, but it was certainly a more broader role than that. But in my own head, again, I thought, if I don't take it, somebody else will take the opportunity. So I grasped it with both hands, and I haven't looked back. I mean, there's some days that are more harder than the other, but I'm very blessed to be in the position that I'm in.
Such an awesome summary. Thank you for sharing. And I obviously know you personally and work with you pretty closely on a day-to-day basis. And one of the things that strikes me about you is that you are very values driven, and the decisions you're making in your personal and your professional life are very tied to your personal values. So the context of how you came to that and the sort of challenges that you had to face to really do that work is really interesting. One of the things that Alex and I are really passionate about is we talk a lot about any kind of change, particularly gender though, for systemic change needs to be men and women working together and walking together. It can't just be the problem of the woman, you know. And so you talked about growing up in a household full of women or dominated by women, but you've worked in two very male-dominated industries, and you're now in a household full of men. You know, you tell the story about Paul and your connection with the Broncos, and obviously he was one of the connections there. Tell us a little bit about your view on men and women walking together and systemic change.
Yeah, look, I think that, you know, working in a male-dominated industry for the whole of my career has given me a bit of a different perspective on how I view diversity. And I think, you know, we need to talk about diversity as more than just women, because there's race, there's ethnicity, there's, you know, disability, there's a whole range of diversity and inclusion components that I just don't think we sort of kind of touch on. And, you know, it's really more about, as you say, you know, building societies rather than having a quota, rather than, you know, getting women into roles. It's really about creating those healthy societies that promote and offer support and systems and processes to be able to make people successful. So I guess, you know, it's something that I'm very interested in. You know, if you have a look at boards, particularly across boards of sporting organisations, you know, how many women are there? How many people of colour or different ethnicity? You know, how many people with disabilities? And I think the question that we should be asking ourselves is, you know, how representative is this of our society? And until we become more representative, well, then we're excluding a whole group of people, whether it's male, female, you know, black or white. So that's sort of kind of a really evident, you know, part for me.
So Tain, I mean, with that as well, I mean, and it's so great to have you here and listening already. So to that point though, I mean, we don't have representation across all those different groups, as you're saying. Why do you think that still is the case? Because it's not for lack of talking about it. I mean, I know when Tiff and I were talking about having this conversation on this series, you're saying, God, you know, it's not like it's a new conversation. It's not like we're going to have the silver bullet. So why are we talking about it again? But, you know, we hear the stats, we see the data, we see the reports, and yet still the dial doesn't seem to be moving fast enough. Like, in your experience, what do you think is contributing to that? What are the obstacles?
Look, I think that the obstacles for me are really around, you know, there's certainly a desire and a want from society to make the change, but I challenge whether organisations are really, and businesses are designing the systems and processes. You know, it's the systems, symbols and behaviours that you need to implement to be able to make people feel included, feel valued and feel successful in their roles. You know, I'll give you an example. And Tiffany, I haven't given you the heads up on this, so sorry. A great example, the 2018 NRL Premiership. So, you know, the NRL were very progressive. We've announced this competition. You know, it was a very successful season. We get to the grand final. And you know, all the words are there. So the women are playing, you know, as part of the grand final. You know, the women had to play at 1:40 in the afternoon. The men's game wasn't until 8 because there was sort of kind of this, you know, interstate cup challenge, you know, in between, which is, you know, by the by. But the more important fact is we played the game. And, you know, the Broncos won. We were delighted. You know, there was a locker room there. We had to get out of the locker room. So the team had to get out of the locker room by 5 o'clock so this other team could come in. There was nowhere for our team to go, the premiership winning team, the inaugural premiership winning team. So we had to grab the premiership trophy and literally leave the stadium, walked a K up the road carrying the trophy and sat outside the bus drinking beer. And then we had to come back in for the presentation before the men's game. So at 7:30, I think it was. So by that stage, the women's passes had expired, so they couldn't actually get back into the stadium. So Tiffany and I were madly running around trying to get 30 passes to get this premiership winning team back into the stadium to be able to run out onto the field to get a presentation, in front of the men's team. And honestly, Tiffany, how long it took us? Over an hour and a half. And we're both standing there going, if this was the Melbourne Storm, if this was the Sydney Roosters men's team, we would not be having this conversation. So you talk about that. For me, that's really systems, symbols and behaviours. We've announced a competition, we're funding it, we're almost there, but we're not quite, we weren't quite there. And obviously last year we played as a doubleheader and we didn't have such an issue. But, I think it's just some of those processes where we're not really examining what are the barriers to success. So what are the barriers to, having more women in roles, and then specifically designing interventions to be able to overcome those barriers and support those people once they get into those roles.
Yeah, it's obviously a personal story, and we face a number of these things in our day jobs, Tain. But you're right. It's an example of the realities, and it's not necessarily barriers that are intentionally put in. And this is the point: they're not intentional barriers to stop women or to stop any kind of group progressing or doing what we think is equal or right. But it's the proactive thought of breaking down those barriers that's required of people in leadership. And you are in a position of leadership, Tain. You have been for years in specific industries as well. What do you think the role of leadership is when you're trying to advocate for systemic change?
Well, I think leadership has to be the voice of the least popular people, or the least enfranchise people, if you like. It's my role, and it's the role of this whole executive. If you look at mining, for example, where we were very keen to promote young women and women into non-traditional roles, so electricians underground, miners underground, and it was really about, well, what are the barriers to young women wanting to be able to take up a career in that? And so it was the strategy that we had to implement was more than making sure we've got toilets underground for females, or making sure we've got appropriate locker rooms. It was about going into schools and going into universities, and schools in grade 8 and 9 versus 10, 11, 12, because it was having a conversation with those individuals and their parents. So inviting them to information sessions. So it's trying to create the change, at the, for want of a better word, at the lowest possible level, and advocating for those who don't necessarily have a voice, but then creating a pathway for them. So it's normalized behavior by the time they get to university, and they're sitting in an engineering course, that there's not one woman in that course, there's 30 of them, So it's about providing that pathway to be able to promote people.
I think, Tain, I know when we were doing our promo, which for those of you who've been on before, we always have lots of fun doing the promos behind the scenes and lots of laughs. But when we were talking about the show, I know, to paraphrase something you'd said, which really stuck with me, you were saying, probably for us as women who've been around for a while and collected lots of wisdom, it's changing for us as well. Like, it's no longer, I think you said something like, it's no longer it doesn't have to be every woman for herself. And that a big part of the role that we have to play is very much, making space for others, not just other women, but up and coming leaders and talent of all shapes and sizes. And it really stuck with me because even as you were recounting your story, I think back to my career in financial services, which was very, I was one of very, very few BDMs. It wasn't as extreme as mining, I'm sure, but I sort of didn't really think about my gender at all. I just got on and did it. But I think you're right. We've got, which kind of links to your question, Tiff, as well, about, the role of leadership. But also does segue into how do we take that responsibility to make space for others? Because a big thing that I unfortunately see quite a bit of is almost there's still competition rather than collaboration, not just necessarily between women, but, across lots of different groups. But for me, this is a big passion for me, that it's got to be around collaboration and moving the dial together rather than every woman or man for his or herself. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, and how are you, I guess, living that in your career?
Obviously, it certainly resonates with me. It's really around, I feel like I have a responsibility now to be able to provide a voice and to create some of those conversations. As you say, Alex, there is space for everyone, and the more that we promote women or diverse groups into positions of power and into leadership roles, the more space that's going to be created, because it becomes normalized. At my role in mining, I was very much, I had to bring people along very covertly, for want of a better word, so you couldn't be seen to be advocating for, a disadvantaged group, whether it be women or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, or, men with disability. It was about, there's a very traditional approach to mining. And Alex, to your point, I would actually say financial services are probably more difficult than mining, because mining, it's just in your face. And rather than it sort of kind of being subversive and just, inherent disadvantage. So it's around normalizing it and getting a group, I guess, a larger cohort to be able to create change, to then normalize the behavior. And then from a leadership perspective, having a clear and consistent and concise message that it's, rather than it being a women's initiative, it's a business imperative, and it's really a core part of you doing business. The women's team at the Broncos is not funded. So this, in 2020, certainly the NRL will be funding it. But the organisation, the Broncos, made a commitment that we would commit. 2 years ago, it cost us $500,000, and that's just a sunk cost, to run a women's competition. But we made a decision. It was a core part of how we do business. And so we value that. And so we invest in it. And it's a best for business approach, because we know in the long term, from a society's perspective, it's the right thing to do. And it's something that we value as an organisation.
When you talk about obviously the role that you've played in the Broncos and building it up, it is funded by you as the team, and it is a sunk cost to an extent. There's obviously breaking boundaries and pushing against the system in just having women play rugby league, right? But and you and I talk about this pretty much daily, but a lot of what we face is having conversations with people that are potentially making them feel uncomfortable. So that idea of being comfortable with being uncomfortable, and indeed inviting that diversity into the conversation and not running away from it. Can you share a little bit with us about what you've done with your relationships in Papua New Guinea in relation to Women's Rugby League, and how that's different to, I guess, conversations you've been having in Australia, or conversations you can have around the men's game?
Yeah, look, never in my wildest dreams did I think I would be advocating for female sexual violence and female empowerment in Papua New Guinea. But, it's such a great opportunity to really engage with a country, and where you can make systemic change in a very short period of time in a very translatable way. Part of our inaugural season, I worked with Oil Search to bring the PNG orchids over for our first trial match. So that created, a partnership and a relationship with Oil Search, who, for those who aren't aware, the Oil Search Foundation, runs, women's shelters and women's houses over in Papua New Guinea, and it's funded, by partnerships. So, I went to Papua New Guinea. It was a great opportunity to be talking about females in sport. I remember we were going to announce the trial match, and sitting, in a press conference beside the head of Oil Search, the head of PNG RFL, the Prime Minister's wife. So she was a sponsor. And we were sitting there at this media conference, and just the absolute hostility from the media, who were all men, who just could not fathom that Oil Search and all the Broncos were going to be putting any funding into a female competition. So that sort of kind of started creating a conversation with Oil Search and with other partners in PNG about, well, what can the Broncos do and how can we use rugby league as a tool to really create conversations? And it's about, obviously in PNG, it's 70%, absolute violence against women, and it's violence. So the way we determined, we could get the most traction was to use, the Broncos and our male ambassadors to be able to get out into communities and start talking to the men in those communities. So, rugby league being the tool to open the door. Oh, wow, Petro Sevenasiva or Corey Parker. And then we can start having conversations with those men. And it's really raw conversations around, it's not okay to hit your wife. It's not okay, to rape your wife. And it's horrific, but it's such an important opportunity for us to use our brand to create some of that change. And earlier this year, we announced a partnership with the Bank of South Pacific, and we're going to be using, again, the Broncos brand to enhance some of their programs. So they have a school-based financial literacy program, and that's about creating awareness and understanding with boys and girls in PNG about, forced saving and what that means. We're working with some of the SMEs in PNG to build their capacity to grow their businesses. And we're also undertaking a lot of work to support their leadership development program, so with their emerging leaders. So what we're doing is really trying to use rugby league to get out into schools, get out into the communities, and people are very welcoming, and they do welcome that. And then creating change, from grassroots up, from young kids, and educating those young kids on what is appropriate and what's not appropriate. So I've been, I'm really passionate about, obviously.
I just want to jump in because I think Tain's underplaying her role in this. For context for everyone on this, Tain's given a bit of explanation of what PNG is like. Rugby league is like a religion over there, so it does open up doors and conversations that we may not otherwise be able to have. But the role of women in that country is very different, and something that the sport is very vocal about. But for Tain, you as an individual, as a woman, to go over to PNG, leading the cause of women playing rugby league in that country, facing that, even the obvious in your face stuff that you would have faced in mining, but also the more covert stuff that maybe Alex and I have come across in our careers. You obviously have a lot of guts and a lot of passion to do that yourself, let alone to take a team with you and get them on board. And so, obviously kudos to you for doing it and for being passionate about it. But it does play to the point of, everyone does have a role in advocating for systemic change. And one of the things I certainly found thinking about this is it can feel really overwhelming. It can feel like, well, I'm just one person and this thing feels really big and hard to shift and change. What could I possibly do? And so I'm keen to get your thoughts on what is the role of every individual, regardless of leadership, position, title, company they work for. What practical tips can you give people to feel empowered to do something?
That is a very good question.
Silver bullet, please.
I was going to say, because I do not have that silver bullet. Look, I think your point is well put around it can feel very overwhelming. And, even now, we're talking, Tiffany, about how we run a 2020 competition for women when they're not professional athletes, they're part-time elite athletes. And so how do we advocate and how do we convince, how do we convince people that we need to continue to invest in it? And so my sort of kind of suggestions are, one, I always go with data. So I'm a bit of a data-based decision maker. So when you talk about, even women in organisations, It's about going to, if you're not in a leadership role, it's about going to your boss or going, having a cohort at work where you can feel like you've got a network of like-minded individuals that you can just start having a conversation with, and that's all it might be to start off with, that you feel that, you don't have to have all the answers. And I guess when I started my career, I was very insular. I didn't ask for advice. I felt I had to know all the answers. I felt that before I could put forward an idea, I had to have explored it fully and I had to know what the direct outcome was going to be. Whereas now I've matured, I guess the richness for me is in about engaging with more people and getting more people who have similar thought or who have similar views, to be able to bounce your ideas off and go, hey, well, if you're at work, is there an opportunity for us to, advocate for more flexible work arrangements? I mean, COVID's been a bloody great opportunity to shake businesses up and for organisations to really understand that the way we've always done business is actually not necessarily serving us any purpose anymore. So again, I'm probably not answering the question as best as I'd like to, but for me, it's about being passionate about the cause. And if you don't believe in it, then you can't, then don't start doing anything about it, because you need to sort of kind of understand that it's going to require a little bit of your time and a bit of commitment. And at times you're going to be unpopular. And my view is, as long as I know that I'm staying true to myself, then that's the only thing that I can do. So I put the business first, and that's underpinned by my values. And so when I know I'm working on behalf of the right story, then I feel very comfortable in advocating across all levels that we're doing the right thing.
And there's no simple answer, is there, Tain? I mean, I love hearing you talk about this. The word that comes to me, comes to mind as I hear you talking about, wow, your experiences in PNG, and you're right, Tiff, that, you were underplaying that. But the word that comes to me is visibility and being visible, because I think, you've sort of interwoven, the fact that it doesn't have to be every person for themselves, that we shouldn't be covert in the way we bring people along. And Tim, you've asked a great question, which I want to come back to around that. But it's as much about, I think, just being visible as role modeling behaviours, even if you don't have a platform like the Broncos brand, but using that for good to broaden a conversation. And I think we can all, as you say, we can all do that. And I think, to your point earlier, Tiff, that means there's going to be uncomfortable times and conversations and all that sort of thing. But that really strikes me, Tain, about what you're talking about, this just being visible and standing for your values and as you were saying before, symbols and behaviours. Tim, you've asked before, and tell me if I've got the context of your question wrong, but Tim's basically said, I'd be interested to hear more about what it means to be covert in approach. And I think Tim's referring back to when you were saying just earlier, Tain, when you're in mining, that you had to try and include people in diversity, but in a very covert way. Like, tell us a bit more about what that looked like.
Okay, so I've got some very specific examples. Sitting on as the only female, on an executive leadership team, and we've got young female mining engineers who have just come through the graduate program, who weren't being offered the same type of opportunities, to work on projects, as some of their male cohorts. So, my role was really offline to spend time with them and provide encouragement and provide support to them. But I couldn't ever, and I'm quite honest in saying this, there would be times when I would have liked to have raised it at an executive team level, but there would be no appetite for it. And for my own personal preservation, am I proud of it? No. But for my own personal preservation, I couldn't risk being ostracised, from a cohort of men who I had to work side by side with, by advocating for females in a very public space. So it wasn't until, from the Anglo-American started to actually invest in young females and having networks and having women's support networks, that it became okay to start talking about it in a really public forum. And that came from the leadership, that came from the CEO. And it's exactly what you're saying, Alex. It's about that visibility. And until somebody actually allows the conversation to commence, you know, from a very senior level, in very male traditional areas, dominated areas, it's hard to be a lone voice. And so could I do it now? 100%. Could I have done it when I was a 28-year-old first-time manager? No, I just didn't feel comfortable.
And it's that safety as well, isn't it? Sorry, Tiff. Yeah, I mean, it so resonates. You're right. I mean, we can only do what we can do. And I think, again, when you're talking about that, Tiff, you and I talk a lot about the importance of community and support and networks and having somewhere where you don't just have to be exposed as the only voice. You know, you've got the support structures, I guess, around you to make change, I think is incredibly important.
And look, and that's why I think, you know, financial executive women is such an important community to be able to have those open conversations. And it might not be about financial, it might be about, you know, your life, it might be about, you know, your local sporting club, or it might be about your children. But, you know, the value that I've found in creating networks over the last 3 years has really brought me comfort, and it's brought me confidence, you know, to be able to know that I can, you know, particularly with you, Tiff, that I can give you a call and go, this is not sitting well with me, you know, and we're able to have those confidential conversations.
Yeah, agreed. And it goes both ways. And I think, you know, one of the things that Few talks about a lot is the role of women in leadership. And generally speaking, the higher you go in the ranks, the more lonely it can often feel, and you don't necessarily have those people around you supporting you. And so I guess, you know, to Alex's point, having those support structures perhaps outside of the organisation or at another organisation like we are for each other, Tain, is so important in remaining passionate and remaining committed to a cause that, you know, we ride the wave and the roller coaster of sometimes there's ups and sometimes there's down, but having the eye on the long game.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and I think, you know, when we talk about, and again, it's not just women, it's about men, women, you know, male, female, you know, in terms of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, in terms of ethnicity, in terms of disability. You know, I find the richest part in my role at the moment, and you know, my role and my husband's role in our family is to, you know, whether, you know, as a parent of 2 young boys, you know, my dream is that as they grow up and take up sport and go into the work, you know, the workforce, that there's no diversity and inclusion or even gender conversation, that their peers, whether they be female or male, you know, are empowered, you know, to have the same opportunity as each other. And, you know, it's my job to empower, you know, my children to have a voice and to challenge those stereotypes. And look, it's not easy. And, you know, it's a regular conversation that we actually have at our dinner table, which sometimes sits well with my husband and which sometimes doesn't, and vice versa, you know. But our kids now are starting to challenge us on those conversations. And, hey, Mum, why aren't the women paid as much as the men? Why aren't they playing 26 rounds versus just 4? So they're asking me the tough questions, and so I've got to come up with answers to that. And fortunately, I'm able to shape and influence some of that. But, you know, until you have you know, a collective and you can start to make change, then, you know, at times you are going to be the only voice, and you just have to maintain the rage, as I say.
Yeah. I'm so glad you mentioned your boys, Tain, because I was going to ask you, because it's such an important part of this conversation, which, I mean, I know the three of us have already alluded to about, you know, we're so passionate about that. It is everyone together. That's what's going to drive change, because men have also been brought up with all those stereotypes that are invasive, you know, and so deep set. And I think so it's great to hear, because I was going to say to you, know, with obviously with young boys, you're obviously thinking about this as well for them. It's not just about girls, but also, can you ask a question, which I think, you know, is kind of, it's probably a segue from what you were just talking about, Tain, about the fact that, you know, some male-dominated sports do have a stigma with behaviours and certain carryings on that we're all aware of. So the question really is, how do you, in a male-dominated sport, managing a team of women, how do you respond to that? What can you do? You know, what can your female teams do to respond to these sort of behaviours, which I think is is probably about this challenging norms and what was acceptable and all these sort of things, but very interested in your comments around that.
So again, I bring it back to it's about being visible and visibly different, and by that I mean, I was really clear that I wanted to treat our women players, the same as the men, and by that I mean same access to services and facilities. So they've got their own training area. We travel at the same level as the men. We get the same playing kit as men. So I wanted the team to be overtly understanding that they were going to be treated, as equals. I deliberately went out and recruited, females into non-traditional roles. So 57% of our coaching staff last year were females. So we had female athletic coaches, female strength coaches, doctors, physios, and so surrounding our women's team with strong women and men who visibly display, the values that our club represents. So, an example, I quite deliberately went out and with our head coach recruited not only the best player in terms of physical form or technical capability, but were they the right cultural fit for us? And by cultural fit, it sometimes meant that we didn't recruit, or we didn't select, the Australian halfback or, whatever it was, but it was really around, we need to be clear on our values and what our club stands for. And so it's creating that positive role models for our children through the selection of the right people who fit our organisation. So I'm saying it's about role modelling, I guess the women are obviously different at any rate because, they would play for free for the club, to be perfectly honest. So anytime they put on the jersey or anytime they say they're a Bronco, they know that their behaviour is expected, and it just, and that's how they interact.
Mm. Yeah, I think, we talk a lot about role modelling, we talk a lot about legacy in gender conversations, but also, at the NRL and when we're talking about the women's game. And there is that potentially overused saying of you can't be what you can't see. And I think what's important is that applies to the men and the women. And Alex, to what you were saying before, and Tain, you were talking about your boys, is that applies to the little boys and the little girls growing up, because the little girls need to be able to see examples of what they could be so they're not questioning it. Can I do it? Because a lot of people on these webinars, Alex yourself included and Tain yourself included, have had to break through and be the first or the second in that industry to be that role model for future generations. So we want to create a space where our, the next generation, whether it's our nieces, our nephews, or our kids, don't have to question that and don't have to push against it. But what it often means is you're creating a legacy, not necessarily going to benefit from it yourself in your own career, in your own generation. And that, Tain, using your words, is to maintain the rage. That's the way to make that happen, I guess.
So powerful. I can't believe it's 12:45. And Margaret Zeta, where are you? I can't see your video on, but Margaret, who's also been an amazing guest on this show, has said, oh, there she is. How great to hear your stories, Tain and Tiff. Having 3 sons, I totally hear you. Leading by example is the way to go. Challenging conversations are embraced in our household. And Donna just says, you're brilliant, Tain. Donna. These are big conversations out there. I mean, I know we've covered a lot of ground, and thank you so much, Tain, for sharing, so many personal stories as well, because I hope, as I know Tiff does, I hope this is the first of many conversations. And even when you just said, you made a comment earlier just about, when we were talking about the importance of community, and you were, I think you said, Tain, that I'm sure a lot of the conversations, even at Few, we have are nothing to do with the financial industry. Unsurprisingly, probably to all of you, I would say probably maybe 1% or maybe 2% are specific. This was the kind of the point, is that the conversations that we have in our community transcend industry. They are about the bigger issues, and they're not just about gender, and it's about including men in a conversation, and it's other groups as well. So that's why, Tiff, I know you and I were really, really excited to have these bigger conversations and hopefully leverage our platform and network as well to leave a legacy and make change. So Tain, thank you so much for joining us. Tiff, is there anything else you had for Tain before we sign off for the day?
Oh, just a massive thank you. And I think you've got so much knowledge and experience to share. And, I hope everyone on here enjoyed it. But yeah, keep maintaining the rage, I say.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I think I'm just excited to be a part of a broader conversation. It's something that's close to my heart, and I'm 100% behind Few, and where I can help, I am, I'm more than happy to. So thanks for inviting me.
Our absolute pleasure, and so grateful to have you on. And yes, Cam, thanks for the reminder. If any of you haven't yet registered for the next 2 in our 3-part series, the link is in the chat. So please do join conversations with us and just keep spreading the word, because this is what it's all about. It's community and having a bigger conversation. Thank you again so much, Tain. Thanks, Tiff.
Thanks, Alex. Thank you, Tain.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So good.
Everyone, have a brilliant day, and we will see you tomorrow, returning to regular programming tomorrow at 12. See you soon.